Buket is a mountain in Malay. The Katu and the high parts of the island were known as the Buket part. It was in Katu that they first started finding the big tin mines.
Okay. Welcome to Fruiting Body Podcast with your host, Brendan O'Neill. We've brought back Colin Mackay today. This is by popular demand. We're going to continue talking about the history of Phuket on this episode. I think we left off around the 1820s, and we're going to be discussing more how Phuket became Phuket when the Chinese came in and exactly what was happening in that era. We'll pretty much move up until the end of World War II, but at that point, as we all know, that's when the tourists arrive and there's not much more information there. So without further ado, over to Colin. Let's take it away, and we're going to jump right into it. We don't really need to recap it. If you want to watch the first episode, click here. I don't know. We'll throw something in there. And you can go watch the first episode. And yeah, we'll take it away. Okay, thanks, Colin, for joining us. Let's just jump right into it, back into your book on the history of Phuket. And if you can take it from, I guess, the 1800s, as we were discussing before.
Sure. Okay. Right. Gather my thoughts. Okay. What we talked about before was the Thai period.
And let's move the mic. Is the mic good?
Is that enough?
Down? Okay, that's good. There we go. All right. Yep.
Yeah. So we talked about the Thai period. So roughly, just to recap, it was Indian, and then the Malays were here, and they became Indianized, and then eventually the Thais moved down from the north. They took over Nakhon Si Thammarat, which is the main town in the peninsula. Phuket Island, which was a tin trading. It was known as the tin island in the satellite state, and it produced a fair bit of money from tin trading, and the Thais ran it, the Thai kings ran it, and nothing really changed here for about 500 years socially. There was, I'd say, 40,000 people doing agriculture, tin mining. Things did start to change around the 1830s. We talked about the British appeared. They took Penang, and then with steamships, they cleaned out the pirates.
Yeah, and that, yeah.
Prior to that, there was very little trade, because as soon as if you went to mine tin anywhere outlying, the pirates would come and get you and steal you as slaves and sell you, take you off to Indonesia and sell you, or sell you further down the coast. But when the British cleared out the pirates, the Chinese, there was overpopulation in China, South China at the time. And they, Chinese love to do business. Thais didn't want to do business. They do agriculture. Only the women tended to deal with money. Men, it was too lordly to deal with money. So they just watched their crops grow, and, they were more a military sort of race. So the Chinese came up and started doing commerce, and word went out. They'd already arrived in Penang and had started mining tin in the northern Malay states, and there was some big tin mines going by then. And then word came out that there was tin in Phuket, particularly in, it was known as Talang then, the whole area, or Salang, or Junk Salang, as it was known, Junk Salon.
And that would have been like the Malay language at that time.
Yeah, it came from Ujang Salang, which is the promontory of the Salang people. We went through that.
Yep.
But Buket is a mountain in Malay. So it was also known as the Katu and the high parts of the island, the mountain, were known as the Buket part. So it was in Katu that they first started finding the big tin mines. Right?
And could people look this up today? Does this mountain, that name, still exist in Malaysia to understand?
Yeah, in KL, one of the main party areas is Bukit Tinggi. It's the Tinggi Hill.
Interesting.
So there's Bukits all over in Malaysia, and also in Indonesia. Buket is a...
This is the Malay word for mountain?
Yeah, or hill.
Or hill.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was known as Hill Island because it is a very mountainous island. And the Thais didn't really go in there because it was thick jungle, and they were doing their rice farming in the Talang, the flat areas. So there were three main towns. There was Bandon, there was Tarua, which means harbor, the port town where the Heron's Monument is.
Yep.
And then Bandon and Ban Lipon were the three main towns.
Where's Ban Lipon?
Ban Lipon is, if you carry on north from, well, if you get to modern Talangtan today, it's basically before that on the right. If you cut in right, there's a town in there. All that agricultural area was where they
I'm familiar with Bandung. It's like
Bandon is, that was more rice, and it's flat land for rice.
Yep.
Ban Lipon was more the orchard area because you're going into the foothills there. It's still today, you know, I run with the Hash House Harriers. There's orchards of durian and rambutan and everything at Ban Lipon. And then Tarua was the sort of commercial town. And there wasn't much else. There was some Malay settlements around the coast. And then the Chinese figured out that there was huge deposits of tin. And just to recap, the tin, when the land folded here, the tin is in the granite. And as the mountains deteriorate, the tin settles in basins. So if you note the whole of Katu, which is now almost all golf courses built around lakes, they were all tin mines.
Yep.
All of that. So how do you get into Katu? The only way in was what is known as Klong Ban Yai, which starts in Sapan Hin, and it runs right through Phuket town. It crosses the main road by the Tesco, you know, and crosses there and heads all the way up until, if you play in the golf courses in Katu, you'll see the rivers all joining in there. And that, going up the river was the only way in, right? So you took boats up the river. So the Thai governor at the time, he was quite happy to have these Chinese coming in and mining because he could tax them for tin. And he also used to take a fee for them coming. They had to pay, they got a beeswax stamp, and they had to pay 1 baht to come in. So so ships were coming up the river as far as, I don't know if you know the old post office in Phuket town.
No.
Okay, they were coming up to where, you know, the clock tower?
Yes.
Right. Just in there was the main ferry, the main pier where people got off. And that's why old Phuket town is based a few roads back from there, right? So that started as a base, and people were there selling picks and shovels, and people cooking tofu. And
this is kind of the kickoff entry point through this Klong.
Yeah, you had to
get
pay
to
your tax, and then, you know, the different... What happened was there was actually...
could you still take those Klongs today as like a tour if you wanted to?
You could, but you know, a lot of them have been, what do you call it? Because of all the digging, they've got much shallower. And Klong Bang Yai is basically a sewer now.
Okay.
I mean, you know, you wouldn't want to, but you could. Yeah, you could take a boat up there in rainy season. So what happened was the governor at the time, and I forget his name.
And we're still around the 1820s, 1850s?
Yeah, 1830s, 1840s, when it became safe to come here. Even coming up here on a ship, you were going to be attacked by pirates. So once the British took out the pirates, the Chinese from Penang, who were British citizens with British protection, started coming up here and mining and setting up these mines. And they then started writing back, and they were all from Amoy province. There was two main guys who came here first and set up a deal with the governor saying, we'll bring a lot of Chinese, you make us the tax farmer, you give me the mining rights, and we'll bring the people and we'll start mining. So then they got their cousins and brothers from their village.
Where were the Chinese coming from in China, mainly?
They were all coming from, at first, almost all of them came from a place, Amoy, which is... it's just further up the coast from Hong Kong, and in a bit it's Hokkien, not Hokkien.
It's like Hokkien. You're getting. Like, I used to live in Shenzhen. That's why. So
okay, so you got to go up the coast about.
Huizhou?
No, go to the next. It's Amoy is the it's the province, right?
Yep.
And there's one town in there that basically fed most of the families who came here, and they came down as single men, so they started taking on local wives. And then you get these half-breed families going, and then they separated, but they were always quite lordly. So you got these half-Chinese Thais coming. Well, they started setting up huge mining sites in Katu, and this was generating serious wealth. So increasingly, the center of operations, or wasn't in Talang where, I mean, what could you take in tax from the rice farmers? Some rice, that was about it. Whereas he could set up and collect tin and make more money. So he moved down to set up his base, the governor in the town in the Buket area, and it became Buket Town or Hill Town, and it became Phuket Town. The town, the Chinese being much more industrious than the Thais. The Thais were making the food for them, growing the food for them. They were just thousands of them came in because it was literally you dig the ground, you wash it out, you get tin, you sell it for make money. I mean,
and they had the experience from Penang, so they know exactly what they're doing.
It's not a lot of experience. I mean, they get more and more sophisticated equipment. It was really, they were just digging and washing it, washing it. If you got some water and you got a piece of log and you put sackcloth or some ridges in and you poured this soil down with water, the tin being heavier would gather into the sackcloth. You empty the sackcloth, you get a tin of this stuff. You take it to the smelter, with blowpipes would get a heat up, and then you get a bar of tin. And that was worth a lot of money in those days. So it was a very easy way to make money.
Were the Chinese bringing the tin back on ships back to China, or were they selling it around Southeast Asia?
They were selling it right here.
And at that time, primarily, what was the tin being used for? Ships? Was it for buildings?
Tin was it had a massive expansion in about the 1850s. Before that, tin is used first of all in bronze. That was why it's historic use. The good thing about tin is it doesn't erode and it doesn't oxidize or erode. So you have tins of food, right? That's another thing. In the Napoleonic Wars, they started in the 1780s, 1800s. Napoleon realized you could pack food rations for troops in tins. And so all the armies of Europe started using tin food. And then afterwards, like when people settled in America, they were taking canned food. So there was a big demand for tin, but the main thing was railways came. And on the rail lines, if you just had them as iron, they would just rust and rot. And so you had to cake them with this tin oxidization. So for all the railways were expanding. And in fact, anything that was engines, rail engines, anything that was exposed to the elements. So on a lot of ships, and also in ships' cannons, you couldn't use a steel cannon on a ship because it would rust. So when you fired it, you would swab it. You put the explosives in there. You swab it. When you put the next gunpowder in, if there was any rusty bits and a bit of an ember got caught, it would blow up and blow your arms off. So you had to have something that didn't erode. So you got this thing called gunmetal. Gunmetal is what all ships' cannons were used. And we're talking the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, when you have, 90 cannons on each side of each ship and thousands of ships. So it was used in anywhere where you needed metal exposed to the elements. You needed to, there's a word for it and I've forgotten, is coating it with tin. And so the demand for tin went through the roof. Most tin in Europe had previously been coming from Devon in England, Cornwall and Devon, which was a big tin mining area, but they were running out of tin. And so suddenly the British, who were taking Malaysia...
Is it anodizing? Is that the process? No.
It'll come to me. It's tin plating. Okay. Tin plating is the name. So also on the bottom of ships and everything, anywhere where you wanted iron, but you wanted it covered from the elements, you use tin. You used to use copper. Copper also doesn't erode. But tin was much cheaper. And so suddenly you had all these supplies of tin coming from the Far East, from India, and it dropped the price in Europe. And so all the European mines couldn't really compete. And the Malay Peninsula, and particularly the island of Bantan and Phuket, became the biggest tin producers in the world. And it brought huge amounts of money. So with that money came a really good governor here in the 1900s called Prior Rashida. And there was a lot of money at that point, but no one wanted to keep their money here because it was the wild east out here. I mean, it wasn't run. There was no law and order. There was a lot of triads. So one Chinese group, let's say the Hokkiens, would be coming down, and then there would be the Hakanese coming, and they would form their own triads to keep their own law and order. So the main mine owners would get together and say they'd have their private armies, so that if people were caught stealing the tin, they'd punish them. They'd say those claims are mine, get the hell off that land.
There was no actual law and order.
No, it was like the Wild West.
Yeah.
There was a British governor who was coming, because the British had their eye on this island. They were ready to take it. So they kept sailing up from Penang and just said, there's like, 25 armed troops here and 50,000 wild Chinamen, who were coming down. So there was whorehouses, there was gambling houses, and Katu was a real wild town. It came from Get Ho, Katu. And Phuket town had its own mafia. And
what did that mean?
Get Ho is a Chinese word. I don't know what it means. But that's where Katu comes from, Get Ho in Thai. Mm-hmm. And so there was, but these were all Chinese gongsis. I don't know if you know, gongsi means
business, though.
Well, they were family heritage centers. So if you were a Tan, right? Most all of them here were named Tan. So that's why you get all these Chinese Thais now called Tan Tuit or Tan Wanat, or they're all beginning with Tan.
Meaning their last name, so people understand
because
that.
they were forced later when it became Thailand to take Thai names, but they all used Tan. And some of them who got different names were named by the king, because the Chinese became the local lords per se, right? Now, ultimately, the Thais still kept control, because if they ever got too out of hand, the local governor could contact Nakhon Si Thammarat, who could contact Bangkok, and they could bring the army down and slaughter the Chinese if they wanted. So the Chinese, meanwhile, the governor would just let the Chinese run it, do all their industry, collect the taxes, cream off most for himself, and send up whatever the king wanted. And in that way, it fast developed the island in the middle. And then they started, Laguna all around, anywhere the low-lying was full of tin. So more and more settlements. The town where we live here in Chantilly is a Chinese town. If you drive through there, you see all the Chinese decorations
in
the main street of Chantilly.
Yes,
and you see they're all Chinese stuff.
In the little gold shops, right here.
They're all Chinese.
The road going basically right to Boat Avenue.
Yeah, there's 100 years. It was a thatched road. I've got a picture in it 100 years ago in the book. And they were mining in Tinlay. It was called Tinlay, which is now Tinlay Place, the party area, Peppers and all that.
Yeah.
They were the Tinlay mines. And so the governor would give out the rights to mine to these various people, and they would bring more and more of these Chinese coolies up, and they were indentured servants. And it was a hell of a life. I mean, can you imagine being out there digging all day, coming home, no aircon, living in a hut? There was a lot of, whether there was malaria, there was certainly a lot of dengue. Some people say there's never been malaria in Phuket. But there was cholera. It was a stinky, filthy, unclean place, and Chinese are even dirtier than the Burmese immigrants today. They would leave their garbage everywhere. There'd be rotting food, people cooking tofu, and I know the British governors, when he came up, several of them just said they were overwhelmed by the stench of the place. Just stunk. It was a horrible, unclean town, right?
Yeah. What were they doing with their dead? And
well, they were, and even if you dig the ground here a lot, I mean, you get a bad smell. So it was a hard life, but they got money in their pockets. They could work for a few years and go back to China, a rich man, right? But increasingly, you found more and more of them going, well, hold on, I can just get some land here and grow a farm, or, I'm falling in love with the Thai girl I'm with, and why would I go back to China? I'm only going to get taxed. And in that time in China, it was illegal to leave China. So all these people leaving, if they actually went back, they were, they could be in big trouble. And at the same time, there were people going there, like in the old days with the British going to Australia. They were paying people their flights to come out. So a lot of criminals and people who wanted to escape from China were coming down and working in the mines. So it was a real rough time. And that went on, up until about the 1870s. They had big riots where they actually chased out the governor, and the governor had to leave, the Thai governor, who was at that time an Afghan, right? Because it was still Siam, remember? So this still was not Thailand. And Siam belonged to the king. So the king would bring Indians, he'd bring Uzbekis in, he'd bring Turkish, he'd bring
to kind of
to run admin. So Chinese, because the Thais essentially didn't work. The Thais were agriculturalists who could produce men for the king for their armies, right? And as long as the king, mainly from the north, that's where the population is in Thailand. There were no people down here, so it would make sense that the king would make the local lord Chinese or Indian, because they were commercial people. And the Indians were coming, selling them clothes, and it was almost no ties here, right? As I say, there was a census taken in the 1890s where it was like 90,000 Chinese and something like 2,000 Malays and about 900 Thais. It was entirely a Chinese island. And the Chinese, the British started putting pressure on, saying to the Thais, look, you've got to let commerce run. Now, at that time, it was still a feudalistic society in Siam. That meant the king owned everyone. There was a system called sak dinar, which means the power of your rice fields. So the king would award you, if I wanted to make you a baron because you had fought well in the last battle with the Burmese, I would give you 1,000 rice fields, which is, if you translate that into Thai, it's the same as the capital of Laos is.
Vientiane?
Yeah, Vientiane, I think, is 1,000 rice fields or something like that.
That's the word for that.
Yeah, so everything was measured in rice fields. So you would be an 8 rice field lord, and you would then give out those rice fields to sublords, and they were beholden to you. And when it came time for the king to rustle up an army and say, okay, look, you've got to produce, 2 boats, 2 long-tail boats, or you've got to produce 8 horsemen and 50 soldiers and bring your own food, you had to do that, or he'd take your rice fields away. He'd bring the other lords and give you their, So the king controlled all the way down by this sak dinar system. So the king will say, well, all that tin's mine, right? But he would then farm it to the local lord. He'd say, you send me this much. So the local lord here would say, right, to the Chinaman, okay, I take this much and you keep the rest. So the smelter would pay like 20%, the tax, the importing it. Well, basically people coming in to sell stuff had to sell to the king's agent first. So he'd be the only one on the dock to meet them. So he'd say, like, I'll pay you this much. And they go, no, it's worth that much. They go, sorry, that's all I'm paying. Well, they had no choice. So they'd sell it for that much. He'd turn around and sell it for this much to the Chinaman, right? So they were creaming these guys. And the Chinese got pissed off. And on several occasions, we talked about the governor's house in Tarua, which is the oldest main structure. He moved out of Phuket town to Tarua eventually because it was too wild. And he built this fortified courthouse, which the Chinese also invaded and attacked, and he had to run to Phang Nga. So the British started saying, look, they were in the process then of taking all the Malay states step by step. And the British were doing it in a way that, was just as bad and corrupt, but they were putting this air of white man's burden, and we're going to civilize your nation, we're going to bring rules, and we want to bring commerce. So they said to Siam, okay, we're now talking about King Chulalongkorn, who's the famous king who reformed Siam. They said to him eventually, a guy came down from Henry Burney was the ambassador from Hong Kong, the British ambassador. Britain had just taken Hong Kong from China. They'd just taken Burma, right? They'd just taken all of India. They'd just taken all the Malay states.
Yeah, but this is still getting into the later 1800s.
Yeah, 1890s, 1880s, 1870s, actually. And they're saying, look, the same as Perry did in Japan with the black ships. He said, you've got to open up to commerce or we're just going to take you over. We'll just colonize you. It's up to you. I mean, it'll take us a few days to colonize you. And so Henry Burney came down to negotiate, and he said, you have to stop slavery. Because what slavery did, it denied a labor force. So, and we want the right, for example, to cut down all your hardwood trees. We want the right to sell all your sugar. We want the right to sell you any arms. We want the right, and then we won't colonize you. Because at the time it was still, we covered this a bit last time.
Yep.
It was still the East India Company. And for the East India Company running it, they were a private company. They didn't want to put in magistrates and soldiers, and that's all on a red line. They just wanted to make money. So they used it. They loved to have little countries that they could just bully and take advantage of. So they would bring a gunboat, full of, they could blast you out the water and say, sign this, or we'll take you over. So, and in a lot of the Malay states, the Malays, they just couldn't run it. So they said, I tell you what, you go and we'll give you this much money every year. You build yourself a big palace, the Malay sultans and kings, and we'll put our advisor in, and he'll run your economy for you and make you a lot more money because we know how to do business, and we'll just pay you to do nothing. And, your kids can go to Eton and they can do all that. You'll be high so. So they did that, and they started doing that with the Thai king. I mean, Chulalongkorn's kids started going to Britain, to Oxford University. Remember, he had hundreds of kids, right? Yeah, tens of kids. So they Henry Burney came down here, and he sort of said, like...
So this is as they're kind of moving up through the Malay Peninsula and moving into...
The guys in Penang, the East India Centre in Penang, which was the oldest centre in Malaysia, was saying, look, it's an absolute shambles in Thailand, right? In Siam. We're getting ripped off. We can't go to work. I'll give you an example for the Straits Tin, which came out of Singapore. Straits Tin... they had new technology, because there was new technology for mining that they were bringing, but the Chinese didn't want to know. They had their way. The Thais didn't want to make any, no one wanted to make any changes here. And the Brits are going, well, look, hold on, we can come in and with dredgers and mine this much quicker. Moreover, we'll pay you money. There was no money then at that. We'll pay you money up front for your tin. We won't take off your tin and leave you some tin. We'll pay you for your ore. We'll smelt it quicker and better. And they were not allowed to do business. In fact, it was a private company set up in Singapore, Straits Tin. So they set up an office in Talang, in Phuket town, and it was like a fortress. And they had these big Indian Sikh guards up there. And the guy, they couldn't make money. They should, by all rights. They were so superior in technology. And when he was questioned at the shareholders meeting in Singapore, there's a quote, exactly his quote from his letter he wrote. He said, the situation in Phuket, right, in the Phuket province in Siam, is one whereby we are more like the football and the Thai governing officials are the players, right? So, I mean, they would just...
Yeah.
So eventually the British said, look, we've got to make new contracts. They sent Burney down. He sailed up the Chao Phraya River with 4 ships. He sat down with Chulalongkorn and he said, you've got to stop slavery. You've got to give us all these rights. You can't keep taking taxes. You've got to drop all your taxes. You've got to open up your country to commerce. And at which point, a lot of reforms came. So that's when you see modern Siam society starting, so that they could start things like a post office, schools, universities, well, not even universities, centers of learning. There was nothing. It was a feudal society before that.
So in terms of slavery, you're meaning that the Thais that were kind of being controlled by the king, and
everyone belonged to the king.
Right. So they were open to start their own businesses and be able to lead.
Yeah, they did it by saying you couldn't. Look, for example, the old system was, if I went cockfighting with you and, I had this much tin and 2 chickens and I bet there was no money. I said, right, I'll bet you my 2 chickens and these 2 tins, and I lost them. And I said, right, I'm doubling down, put me in bondage, right? And I lose again, I'm now your slave, okay, right? For whatever the term of your agreement is. And these were honored. These agreements were honored. If you broke the agreement as a slave, you were killed, or, because the slave owners owned the place. So they really enforced slavery. Or, I'll let you have my wife for 5 years. You can do whatever you want with her. And then he'd go cockfighting again. Cockfighting was a great generator of slavery. So people could own each other. And everyone was ultimately owned. The lords were owned by the king. The lords owned all the people in their province. But more and more that it was made that as slaves died, you couldn't enslave their children. So the children started becoming free. And eventually by 1905, slavery was abolished here.
So what was the changing factor like in terms of not just civilizing Thailand, but growing its economy? As these children became enslaved, what were they doing in terms of business?
Well, then the British companies and the German companies moving in could get employees and pay them money. So then you get things like, what did people do with the money they made from tin before? They all headed down to Penang, and they bought property with it because there was law and order in Penang because the British were there. They didn't leave their money here because if you'd be broken into and all your tin would be stolen, or if you swapped it for gold or whatever, it would be stolen, or you'd be killed, and there was no law and order. Right, the biggest triad guys would just come and take it. So even the triad guys, the lords would have these fancy houses in Penang. They'd put all their kids into British schools there. So they were all English speaking here. It was like a sub-colony of Britain run from Penang. And the Thai governor and the Thai government still controlled it per se, only because the British didn't want to have all the administration in there. They just wanted to take the money out, right? So if they couldn't get laborers to work in the tin mines, that's why they brought the Chinese in, right? The Chinese came anyway. The Chinese-British brought the Chinese, the partners in. So, suddenly it became a very Chinese island. And then Siam opened up to the west, to Britain. And then it was like, allow commerce, allow us to, do your rice crop and do shipping and sell you. They like Standard Chartered Bank moved up here from Singapore and opened up where the clock tower is. That was the first Standard Chartered Bank.
Were there other things being traded as well? So I know we were primarily focused on the tin, but did the rubber plantations?
They hadn't got here yet. Okay. Rubber hadn't got here yet. So first rubber came about 1905. So there was jungle products, and they were growing a lot of ganja and weed here, and they were selling that to Indians. There was textiles, there was commerce, but not much, right? I mean, the tin was the be-all and end-all.
Yeah.
And then you could sell them picks and shovels and, whores and gambling dens, and that's what they spent all their money on. But there was still no money, per se. They had finger bars of tin, and they would cut that into smaller and smaller cubes.
That's what they were using to be
until the Standard Chartered Bank came here, and they said, look, I tell you what, we'll give you money. You bring us the tin, we'll put it in our hole, and then we'll ship it down, and we'll give you coins or eventually paper money. And so money started circulating, and they first came, I'm trying to get the date right, but...
was this Thai money or was it British money?
British money.
British money. So in Thailand at this point, there was no currency, or was it?
Look, the Baht, I believe the Baht was formed in the 1920s or 1930s. Siam Commercial Bank was the first Thai bank, which was formed by the king and some of his advisors, and they made their own currency, again, led by British advisors, telling them, if you want an economy to grow, if you want commerce, you need to have money. To have money, you've got to have banks, you've got to have depository. And so, of course, this is kind of like Bitcoin world now. It's a new type of money, and people learned to trust it, and it was backed by the government. It was backed by the British, and then eventually what you saw here was the Germans, who only formed as a country in 1870 and were the strongest in Europe, the most powerful in Europe, but they didn't have colonies because the Portuguese, Brits and the French and the Dutch and the Spanish had taken over the whole world already. So they were left going, right, we need some colonies. What did they get? They got Namibia and Togo and Tanzania, just the butt end places. The only one still left was Thailand, which was a gem of a place, and Japan, right? Had not yet been colonized. So they tried to come in and work with the king to take over. The British and the French gathered together and said, if you go like the German companies tried to take over Phuket. They still exist today. They tried to buy Phuket from the king for cash so that they could do the mining. Metallgeschaft was one, I think. And the Brits said, no, you can't have the German. This is our area. And the French were also ripping off Siam from the other side, from Indonesia, from the Cambodian side, or Indochina side.
Yep.
And that was when they decided, look, we'll just try and divide the country between us and stop the Germans coming in. At which point the British said, no, we don't, because they'd almost had a war up in with the French.
So they completely stopped the Germans from coming in and having any control.
Yeah, well, they didn't, because the Germans were smart, right? They're smarter businessmen than the Brits and French. They came in and said, we'll subsidize you need railways. We'll pay for all your railways. So the whole railway that comes down from Suratani and all that. And the British were like, hold on, we don't want a railway, because they wanted to protect Singapore and their business. The French came in and said, we'll undercut whatever the British are doing. So eventually all the coal, and there was a lot of coal mining, I think it was at the time, all the rice, everything was being shipped on German ships. Mm-hmm. And they were stealing the business through commerce from the Brits. Brits didn't like it, but they couldn't do much about it because they couldn't go to war. It was a commercial war, right? And so then the Kaiser was inviting all the Chulalongkorn did a tour of Europe. Meanwhile, the Russians, as I said, were also interested in Phuket because they need a coaling station to go from the Baltic round to, particularly in 1905 in the war with Japan, they needed to get a lot more navy over to the east side of Russia, to the Pacific.
Yep.
And they couldn't do it on one, they needed to stop somewhere to coal. And Phuket, as I say, was the only place in the whole Bay of Bengal that wasn't a British colony, right? If you think about it, or Dutch, right? With Sumatra, all Malaysia, Burma, all India, Sri Lanka, right? And if you carry that on round, India, Oman, all down East Africa, was all British. So after the Suez Canal, the only place they could stop was Phuket. So they then started buttering up the king. So you see these photos, they're quite famous now, of the Tsar and Chulalongkorn in Moscow. And the Germans, meanwhile, was saying, look, we'll bring your sons and put them in our military college, and we'll sell you your guns. Because they knew a war was coming. They knew a war was coming, and the Germans were trying to get the ties on their side. Anyway, the First World War did come. Prior to that, as I say, the Germans became dominant, and the Brits were busy in Malaysia. The French were busy in Indochina. Brits, there was a big lobby all the time saying, let's just join Malaysia with Burma and just take this piece of land. And it's a lucrative piece of land. It's miserably run by the Thais, so the Siamese. If we put in British governors, we can make it a very prosperous province. We can put in roads, we can put in bridges, we can put in all the stuff you need for infrastructure. And so there was huge pressure. And on several occasions, the British were about to take this place, but they were always stopped for various other reasons by the British government. So it remained independent. And then we see the next big change is the First World War coming. And everyone was calling on, I forget which king it was. It was Chulalongkorn, I think, was the king then. I'll correct the numbers, but I think it was Chulalongkorn. And he said, look, we'll be what do you call it? We won't take sides.
Neutral, essentially.
Yeah, we'll be neutral. So it became a real center for spying. There were ships going off to Phuket to spy on India, German spies, and the Italians. No, they came in the Second World War. Siam did okay out of it, but the British, when they won the war, they were very happy to imprison all the German expats who were here and throw them out the country and take back all the business. So Britain recontrolled all the commerce in Siam. Now, increasingly, what you started getting from the Chinese was a middle class, an independent middle class now, because the freed slaves and the Chinese marrying with local women were having freeborn children. Mm-hmm. Who were beginning to get money and wealth and build nice houses. And they were going, we don't like this autocratic society where, remember, you couldn't even look at the king before. If you looked at the king, if he went past, you would have your eyes gouged out. Things like that were going on. So
This is still the
it's
World
Siam.
War.
It was still Siam, the kingdom of Siam, right?
It's still almost the Wild West at this point.
Well, I'm talking about all of Siam at this point,
Yeah.
which but Phuket was part of Siam. So the middle class started saying, and the place where people really jumped up in level was in the army. So free men could join the army, and if it was a meritocracy in the army, whereas in society it wasn't. You were either born rich, you were lord class, or you were not. Or you were a Chinaman doing business. Or you were down, but then it got that blurred because now they're Thai Chinese, who are Thai family and Chinese doing business with far more money than the rich lords, because they own, a printing factory or whatever, and they're making more money than the guy with some orchards and rice fields. But his heritage and his position in society, in the old Thai society, which still continues today, right? There's a lord class. But the middle class started banging on their ceiling. And the biggest meritocracy at that point was the army. So it was coming out of the military officers. They were being sent overseas to train in Europe. They were picking up these ideas in the 20s and 30s in Europe of, communism, nationalism, like why should be a kingdom? We should become a country. Remember, all European countries were kingdoms. And then after the Second World War, they all became national countries. And you got the rise of nationalism and Nazism. And the exact example was Turkey, which was the Ottoman Empire, like the Siamese Empire, owned lots of different peoples, all run by the Ottoman king. But the Bulgarians and the Greeks, and they eventually all took their independence. And the Turks gave away, the Middle East, and they were forced to because they lost the war. But they kept the Turkish lands with the Turks, and they called it Turkey. The same time here in Siam, to preserve the main Thai areas, the king of Siam gave away the Malay states. He gave away the Burmese. He gave away Laos. He didn't say gave away. He was forced to concede land. So it eventually evolved down to a much smaller country, which was where the Thais were. And then you got this guy came up. I'm going to just break back a bit to rubber, right?
Yep. Because
that affects Phuket. Rubber started in Brazil and also a little bit in West Africa. It's an Atlantic fruit, right? And it was suddenly became popular, I believe, around the 1870s. It suddenly you needed it in the Industrial Revolution to cushion metals banging, and rubber. It's massively used,
especially for war as well,
particularly for armies and for running navies as well. You need a lot of rubber in, and so you got this area, this friction going on in Brazil when. There's horror stories of the Americans going in there and trying to make out huge areas of cutting down the forest and enslaving populations, and people trying to steal the rubber to take it to, like, Peru, the Spanish colonies, and the Brazilians were fighting on it. Meanwhile, there was a British guy. It's a bit of a wild story, but it said this guy went ashore with these high-heeled shoes, and every time he went back to the ship, he filled his heels of his shoes with rubber tree seeds, which is bullshit, right? I mean, it's a lovely story that this guy Wickham, Captain Wickham, stole all the rubber seeds. He took them back to Kew Garden in London, which was a greenhouse garden, and they developed them into something like 200 rubber trees in the greenhouses in Kew Garden. And they said, look, we can take these, the perfectly same in Ceylon, in Malay, in Singapore. So they were all shipped out in Sri Lanka. All the trees died. In Singapore, 17 of these things survived. 17 shoots.
That's because you needed that same climate as Brazil.
The same climate.
Yeah.
And so there was a guy called, he was known as Rubber Riddley eventually. I think his Nicholas Riddley was in charge of the gardens, the main horticulturalists of Singapore. And he realized the value of these trees. And he went around parties with seeds, and giving them out, and everyone thought he was crazy. But in Singapore, more and more people started growing rubber in the island of Singapore. And suddenly the rubber price went through the roof. And at that point, some of these British settlers in Malaysia said, well, hold on, I've got all this jungle, I'm growing durian, and they started cutting down and doing rubber. In 1915, this really, really good governor here, who was Prior Rashida, who took over in Phuket town and developed modern, old Phuket town. Mm-hmm. He made the prison, he made the courthouses, he laid out all the streets, he implemented many things from like Penang. He brought up all his architect friends from Penang. He was a Penang British family. They became Thai eventually.
They're using that as like kind of the foundation to.
Yeah, and so he had houses in Penang, and he had all the miners were here. So that was again the Kaur family. They were the Kaurs. His father had started as a governor in Ranong, and they still have the big family grave site up in Ranong. And he was a very good governor who actually paid his taxes on time, as a tax farmer. He did things like, build roads, and build bridges, and all the things the king liked, and all the things the British were demanding, otherwise they would take it over.
Yep.
So remember that the Siamese wanted to have English-speaking people who could deal with the Brits and civilize it enough to stop the British from taking it over. So the Kaur family, or Kaur Simbi, or Prior Rashida, he became the governor of Trang. He had been the governor of another province. All his sons became governors of the province, and they were all really good governors, particularly this little guy. He was about 4'2", and he liked golf. So just across from your house here is the Surin Golf Course.
Yeah, it was.
He started that one, right? And there's pictures of him in his +4s and his, someone said he looks like a goose egg. One of the Brits were coming up here. It was a good place to come to do tiger hunting on elephant back. Mm-hmm. So they would come up for the weekend and stay in the new hotel, which was what's the fancy hotel?
Right here?
No, the On Hotel. It's now in Phuket town.
Okay.
It's where they shot the beach and all that. It's a famous old Chinese hotel. So you could come up here as a Brit and basically come for the weekend on the steamship, and you could play golf at Surin. You could go tiger hunting by elephant. I'm sure there was bounteous women, and like Soy Romani was run by a Romanian woman, and it was a big hooker street in town. So it was a good place for expats from Penang to come for a few days for the weekend, and so it was quite Britified, and the rich Chinese Thais would all go down there for the weekend and buy all the latest fashions from London and what lipstick. And
which year was this around?
This was basically going from 1895 till 1940, right? Okay. During these interwar years, it became quite trendy to come up here and have fun in Phuket for all the Malay Singaporeans. The steamer went from Ranong, capital of Burma.
Yangon?
Yeah, or Rangoon, sorry, not. Rangoon, it would come down to stop at one other stop above, then it would stop at Phuket, then it would stop at Penang, then it would stop at Malacca, and then it would stop in Singapore. Yep. And it ran constantly. So you had postal services, and then planes started appearing, so they built the airport. So slowly it became into the modern world, and people were using money. When the rubber trees came, the Chinese were going, well, hold on. We own all this land by rights, and only that bit produces tin. They're going, we'll buy a load of these rubber trees, promote it. In fact, the governor himself up-fronted money and bought a load from Singapore and brought them up and started getting locals to plant them. And sure enough, they realized you could sell this rubber. It was a huge spike in the price of rubber, especially during the First World War. They needed it. So everyone started cutting down the jungle, building rubber trees. To get there every day, you needed roads and paths. And suddenly this thickly jungled island, which was full of, black panthers and tigers and, I don't think there were orangutans, but there might have been, but monkeys and pythons and spiders. You never even wanted to go in the jungle areas, right? Suddenly they were all cut. The animals were all eaten, I presume. And then you could say bring goats and chickens but mainly rubber trees. Everywhere here is rubber trees now.
And then that was starting around the after or before the First World War?
That started here about 1915 and got to, the biggest peak year of production was about 1970. So it ran right through. But rubber is what really opened up the whole of South Thailand, right? Because you could just destroy the jungle. And then they started getting palm oil, right? Became useful. So palm oil plantations also, you just take out the jungle and you put a road in and there are workers in there and workers' camps and the whole place opened up. Right?
What were they using palm oil for back then? Because now it's primarily used for, who knows, fillers and whatnot.
Yeah, it's lots of types of oil, but any cooking oil. Also, it was used, like whale oil was running out at that point. So palm oil was used. Soap was you have to look up the use of palm oil. But rubber became, the thing about rubber is when it rains, you can't use it. You know, if you you tap the tree, it goes into that ball. But if it rains in there, it's useless. So whereas palm oil, I know because I own some palm oil plantations and rubber is better money, but more irregularly. Palm oil, you know that every 20 days you're going to cut a certain amount down. Mm-hmm. So that's really what opened this area up. And then came, more commerce, ships coming in, monetizing it. They started building roads within the east part of the island.
Yep.
The west was still, had to go by boat around to it. I think they only built the road from Phuket town over to Patong in the late 1960s, the 70s, and there were 2 people killed by tigers when they were doing it. They used to have armed guards, against the tigers. So the Tiger Temple on the top where they all beat their horn.
The tiger,
you're going from Katu, from the go-kart and all that.
Yeah.
You go over the top and come down to Patong.
Yep.
And at the top, everyone's beeping their horn. There's a little temple there.
Okay.
That's called the Tiger Temple.
I didn't know they're beeping their horn for.
No, they all beat their horn at the top, and it's just to the Tiger Temple because they were 2 people killed there building the road over, and if you go into that temple, it's got all these tigers built in and stuff.
Well, they're saying that I think the last tiger was killed in the 70s here or something.
No, in the 90s.
In the 90s,
92 or 93.
Was that they had to get rid of them, or was it primarily it was the Chinese with the because the Chinese medicine, they love tiger? Who knows?
They I've got a picture in here on Laguna. You play golf on the Laguna golf course. The last one shot here was in Laguna was I believe 1978, and I met the guy who'd shot him. He was the police officer in Chantilly, and the woman who helped me with my book knew him, and I went to Phang Nga and met him. But when I first moved here in 1998, I was going to take a house in Kamala, and there was an old Danish guy who had been developing a couple of houses, and he told me, "Oh no, I know the guy who shot the last tiger, right? The last known tiger shot." And I went round to meet his family, and what had happened on that occasion was, the hills between here and Kamala, they're pretty high. I mean, they're pretty even today. There's still a lot of jungle up there, and they were living up there. But because they're Muslims in Kamala, they kept a lot of goats, and the tigers were coming down this tiger was coming down and stealing goats, right? And it was pissing off the locals. And more importantly, they had the new school built it's further back inland up the valley. Yeah. There's a new school there, and the kids are walking to school. I'm talking 1993, it wasn't long ago. And the goat pens were near the road, and they were worried that the tiger might take, so they decided to hunt it and kill it. And I met the guy who'd done it. I mean, he'd still be alive today. Or who the Danish guy told me had been the guy who had done it.
And were they were also killing all the panthers as well? And was that just more for protection, or
it's sport at first? Sport. The Brits.
Is there any rumor that there could be something still out there, or is it? It's pretty obvious now. Everything's gone.
Yeah. Look, even me, and I know this island very well because I've been running with the hash here, and we go and run in the mountains. Even when I first came here, I saw when I would go out and recce these runs by myself. You'd see a lot of snakes, cobras. You can still see them. But there were an enormous number of different types of civet cat. and some of them are as big as this sofa.
Civet cat.
Civet cats, right? And there's one that I saw that I've never seen any animal like it. And it was like black, like a fox, with almost like a dog's nose. And I saw it, I heard it running on the leaves. And I looked, and there's this black, but it had a long, puffy tail. It was almost like a black fox, but it just went straight up a tree and ran right up the tree. And I go, what the fuck's that, right?
Yeah.
And I couldn't, it was a big height. There's still uncut natural trees. It disappeared up there. And I was like, damn, I was up by myself. I mentioned it to Martin Carpenter, who was the British honorary consul here at the time, who was running. I said, I saw this weird animal. I went down to the fisheries department, land mammals and fisheries department, to ask them, what was this animal I saw? I couldn't photograph it. They didn't care, right? They didn't. I said, this is an animal I've never seen, right? We had those mini macaque monkeys until recently, where the new hotel there used to be a huge armies of them. Macaque monkeys like this big. Mm-hmm. I don't think they live anywhere in it. They've all gone now. I don't know if they've all been eaten. I went up there about 8 months ago to show a friend these monkeys, and they've all gone. I said, the locals, where the monkey? Oh, bailao. I said, well, you ate them all. No, bailao. I don't know where they've eaten them or but they've gone, right? These are national treasure, or island treasures, should I say. Anyway, if you believe the British honorary consul, right, that Martin Carpenter, who was running the Blue Canyon golf course, he said, I've seen exactly the same thing. He said, I saw one bounding across the Blue Tree, which has got forests on either side, Blue Canyon golf course, early one morning. The same thing, like a black fox.
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows what it is. I never see any civet cats anymore. Yeah. And the other one was flying foxes, huge flying foxes, half the size of me. And you could tell when you're walking through the jungle because there'd be all this dust.
Yeah.
And you'd look up and they'd be in the trees, but these are like dogs hanging on the tree, and then they'd take off.
But they're only way up in those mountains. Like even if you go to Pak Lok and then.
Well, I guess they move around a bit. The gibbons come down a bit. There are still wild gibbons up there, but not many. Mm. Are there tigers? I doubt it. There's not enough for them to eat them. Yeah. And most of the jungle's been penetrated. They need a long area to work in. I reckon they've all gone.
Yeah, and there's a lot of dirt biking trails out there that you can basically take off from, I don't know, Kamala, Sarin, whatever the dam.
Dirt biking, hiking,
take it
trail
right
running,
down to, you can follow that right down to Geelong.
Yeah, you can follow the whole ridges all the way. I mean, I literally know most of the trail. After 25 years of running twice a week and setting trails, we know certainly the hashes of. We've never really no one's seen a tiger, and there's literally every day of the week, there's up in the furthest parts, there's some hash-house harrier laying a trail here. So, no, I think the tigers have gone, all the exotic animals have gone. We've still got elephants, but they're all
Who's living up in those mountains now? Because I have friends that go up there, and they say they've been shot at before. Who knows?
Yeah, they shot my dog. You heard about that one, didn't you?
No.
A couple of weeks ago, I was walking with my dog on a trail with Justin and another guy. Yeah. And it was a Muslim goat farm, and my lovely white sort of shepherd dog just walking ahead, bang, shot in the mouth.
Is it dead?
Yeah, it killed him. So it was a story in the newspaper. I went to it. It was, she used to sleep with my daughter, and my daughter loved it. Yeah. So they shot, but yeah, they still shoot animals up there. They when you go to the non-hunting area opposite the school, you see them all going hunting there, but there's not much left. If you go up there, there's nothing. There's not even mosquitoes because there's nothing for the mosquitoes to feed on, I mean, you'll see reptiles, you'll see frogs and snakes and spiders, loads of spiders, these orb spiders. Right?
Are they called like banana tree spiders or something?
They're called orb.
They look scary.
They're huge.
They're like this size. Apparently they're not dangerous.
No, they're not.
And apparently even if they get on you, they don't bite. But if you
I've had them on. I run, well, not so much now, but I used to run shirtless, and because they go between the rubber trees.
Yes.
They're usually at about face height or chest height, and if you're running, you don't see them. You run straight. Oh, they're freaky on you, but no, they're no one. Yeah, they're just freaky.
I've seen them close up, but they got these fangs on them that are massive.
they never bite and they're not venomous. And
strange.
But they're freaky. If you get one on your face, it's like...
no, they're about the size of my hand.
Yeah, or bigger.
Oh, yeah, I've seen them. It's
But no, they're smaller bodies, but long legs. Anyway, so where are we getting to? Right, now, so here comes the big change, Thailand.
Well, check. How are we on time? 1 hour? Oh, we're good. Okay.
Okay,
He always puts these notes here, and I forget which one. What do they represent? 30 minutes? 30. All right, got it now.
1:30 to 1 hour.
Okay. Yeah, so
so now we're going to Thailand. So there's Siam. He's under pressure from Britain, under pressure from France on the other side. The Germans have been booted out. There is a middle class forming, and people are getting more and more pissed off with the king taking all the money and everything belonging to the king. So at the same time, you saw Franco take over Spain from the king. You saw Ataturk take over from the what do you call it? The king, the Turkish king, whatever he was called. You saw Hitler take at the same time, this guy, Wichit Songkran, who was a really nasty piece of work in my books, right? He was a very proud Thai. He'd been sent by the army and studied in France and I believe Britain. And there was a coup of the officers. What happened was the king went down to play golf at, where's the king's palace on the way to Hua Hin, right? So he was at his beach palace and the military moved in and took over all his royal positions in Bangkok. And they sent him an ultimatum to say, look, we don't want to live in an autocracy anymore. We want a parliament. We want the people to have some say in the running of this country. So either accept that or, we'll kill all the lords we've captured. And so the king himself, this was the one after, I think it was Rama 4. Rama 5, I forget which one. The son from Chulalongkorn, or one of the sons who took over. He was also quite a liberal king. He said, "Look, I'm happy to open up the country and have a parliament and listen to a parliament." And he had bad eyes, and he did soon after leave to get eye surgery in Europe and never came back. And so the army took over. And the army started running it. And then you got these two factions in the army, 3 or 4 factions. There was a royalist faction who wanted to keep the king. And there was the more communist-led. Remember now, communism was a force in China. The communists were going there. The communists were starting in Vietnam, now in the 30s, pushing into the 40s. And the more leftist, by this guy Priddy, sort of said, no, we want what do you call it? Without a king, we want to run it as a
democracy or a democracy at this point.
What do you call a country without, like Australia wants to be right now without the Queen
socialism?
No. I forget the word. Got up too early to watch the Masters.
Yeah, no worries.
This morning. Anyway, so eventually there was some big fighting between the armies, and this guy, Wichit Songkran, came out on top. And he got the Air Force behind him, and he started killing off his opposition, and he became the main head honcho here. And he entirely changed Siamese society. He said, right, there will be no... He was very anti-Chinese. He rather like Hitler blamed the Jews, he blamed the Chinese. He said, we don't want more Chinese. They're taking over this country. They run all the business. All Chinese, you either have to speak Thai, take a Thai name. There will be no more Chinese schools. Remember, there were a lot of Chinese schools here. So the Chinese were learning Chinese. And, so cut the Chinese schools, cut all Chinese dress, right? So you couldn't wear pigtails and pajamas and dress like the Chinese dress. Like even in Malaysia today, they still dress like Chinese. No Chinese signs on shops. Everything has to be written in Thai. And also, we're going to modernize this country. So you can't sit on the floor anymore to eat songtan. You can't dress as... He also didn't like the Muslims, right? He said, you will become Thais. So they were Malays. Now they're called Thai Muslims, but they were Malays, right? You can't wear sarongs. You have to dress basically like Humphrey Bogart, right? And there's pictures. A woman should wear bobby socks and like 1940s America. And that was, you were arrested if you weren't dressed like that, right? So if you wore a triangular hat or something, you could be arrested. You were put in prison. You had to get a certain hair. You couldn't have long hair. You had to have short hair. That's why all the schools still had. You had to salute the flag every day, the Thai flag. They made a new Thai flag. There was the Siamese flag was an elephant in the middle of a white background. And he made a new Thai national flag. He made it the nation of Thai and Thais. He called it Thailand. They got rid of all the Burmese they could. They forced the Chinese to speak Thai and take Thai names. So that's why you see all these Tantawit and all the really long names tend to be Chinese taking names that tend to say like, Lucky Gold Bird or something, if you translate them.
Yep.
And the lordly Chinese, who he also wanted to butter up because, he needed their money and stuff, the king had already started giving them royal title names. So I can't remember some of them, but some of the big families here have these royal Thai names. And he really invested a lot of money into the army, and the military became overwhelmingly powerful as they remain today, right? So he was very lucky because at this point in the 30s, Japan invaded China. And Japan, for its war, it needed rubber. China didn't have rubber, right? And it wanted to get access to Southeast Asia for the oil in Indonesia and for the rubber to run its war machine, right? There were rubber trees in the Philippines, the Americans were there. There were rubber trees in Malaysia, the Brits were there. Indonesians were there. In Indochina, the French were there. And there were a lot of sanctions put on Japan for its brutal war in China. And then you start seeing 1938, 39, Hitler's going crazy, right? And war breaks out in Europe. And so suddenly the Europeans were on their back foot in Asia because they had to fight in Europe. They couldn't.
The Japanese are coming in
well,
at this point.
They didn't know that at that point. We're talking 1939, 1940.
The beginning of the
Japanese only started in December 41. So, but everyone knew that. Then they made the Axis partnership. The Americans, the Brits, they all knew that Japan was going to expand and attack. So they all wanted the Allies wanted Pibum Songkran on their side. So they were giving him all the weapons he wanted. Meanwhile, he was going to the Japanese and saying, look, we're the only other independent country. You're a fascistic country. You're joining with Hitler and Mussolini and all of them. And we're a military government. We're independent Asians. We should be Asian brothers and free. And the Japanese started taking over all the business. They started sending down people, selling all the matches and all the toys and all the and they started trying to buy all the rubber from Thailand. It was the only place they could get rubber. So there was a whole period then when the expats who were here, the foreigners who were still, all the tin mines were being run by British expatriates or Dutch expatriates because and there were a lot of Japanese coming down as spies and Japanese dentists and the Japanese started taking over.
But their time here, of control of the Japanese coming in, it was still quite brief.
Yeah, but they started really showing up in the 30s, the Japanese, because they came in dominant economy. So they started giving these really sweetheart deals to the Thais. So meanwhile, the Allies, it's a very strategic position Thailand has. It's the crossroads of Asia.
Yep.
So if Siam or if Pibum Songkran joined the Allies, they could stop the Japanese from coming south, right? If he joined with the Japanese, they could basically attack Britain all over, so or the British colonies all over, and attack the French. And remember the Vichy France by now. Hitler had taken France, so Vichy France had also become a right-wing it was under the control of Vichy France now. And they were basically powerless. So what does people in Songkran do? He goes, right, I'm going to go to war with Vietnam, right? With Vichy France. I don't know if you know about this war. But Thais had been so humiliated by the French stealing land off them just because they were stronger, that now that they were weak, this is quite a normal Thai trait, right? If someone's weak, you kick them then. He said, I'm declaring war on Vichy France. So he was aligning more and more with the Japanese and Hitler and Mussolini. And so he launched a war. The first 3 or 4 days, he advanced quite far into Cambodia because Vichy France was cut off. They only had a few soldiers. All their people were in Japan. And they had a very small fleet and not many tanks. But he'd been building up all this equipment, getting it from the Allies on the premise that it would fight against Japan. And he went and attacked to make Thailand. He wanted, again, to recreate Siam, kind of like Putin's doing now. Mm-hmm. He wanted to make Siam as Thailand and make Greater Thailand and unify all the Thai peoples, which was the Laos who are Thais, the Cambodian side and so he had this vision, and it was Maha. The word is Thai. It means the great Mahathai, right? Is the large Thailand, a Greater Thailand. The same as Hitler was making, taking over Sudetenland and all that. He was borrowing these ideas. And he got in these, this, I forget his name again, a really good, like Joseph Goebbels, he brought in a propaganda minister who started writing, I forget his name, really clever stuff about the Thais are the greatest nation. They've never been conquered by anyone. They're greater than any other nation, almost like the Germanic, Hitler's Germanic thing, copying all these ideas, throwing all the opposition into prison. But still the Allies wanted to deal with him because they needed him on their side, and the Japanese needed him. So he was in a very comfy position. So when he went to war with France, the Allies kind of backed off, and Japan helped him with weapons. But the Thais didn't do very well, and they came to a standstill after about 5 days.
How far did they get into Cambodia?
But 2 or 3 days march. They didn't get to Phnom Penh. They probably got over Rani Pathet, and the few French soldiers that were there held the overwhelming numbers of Thais to a standstill. And then he took the fleet. He sent the Thai fleet, where he'd been developing a fleet. He sent them south, and the Vichy fleet, which was much older but had a couple of bigger ships in it that had stayed here. They had a big naval battle for a morning off Koh Muk, Koh Chang and Koh Muk. Yep. And basically the French wiped out the Thai fleet in, I think, 3 hours. They destroyed all their ships.
This information and this part of the history of Thailand, when you did your research, was this easily accessible?
Yeah, it's on Google. You can Google it.
But I mean, are the Thais, are they taught this as well, or are they told something else?
No, they're told something else. But it's on Google, and it's not illegal to read it or anything or say it.
Yeah, and if you were to read this on Google, or like the Thai government clearly is not blocking this information.
They're not blocking it. But they're not teaching it in school. They're not. They just don't teach history because their recent history hasn't been a very proud history, put it that way. Their long history is a proud history, and they teach that. The Buddhism, the king, the greatness of Thailand, they've never been conquered, all of that. And rightfully so. I mean, they were a unique people. And they're a historic old people and a great people. But the time around people in Songkran, they were really sleazy. I mean, as I think Rosewood, the British ambassador, said, increasingly oily Richard Songkran, I see Thailanders acting like a whore. I mean, they were taking from the Japanese. They were taking because they were in a prime position to take.
And what is their perspective on him as well as like in Thailand in general? Do they also look down on him, or they kind of just sweep it under the rug?
They more or less sweep it under the rug. But remember, he was the one who put the military in charge. The military controlled this country, right? Mm-hmm. The military brought the king back eventually and put him up. The king being there allows the military to be strong. The military they own all the most of the banks. They own the generals are the rich guys.
Yeah.
And he set them up, so you can't badmouth them too much. I mean, I'm already treading on toes now, right?
Yeah.
So, when the Japanese increasingly were going to attack, when they did attack Pearl Harbor, they also attacked the Philippine Islands, the two bases there, right, and Manila.
Yep.
At the same time, they attacked Hong Kong. The same day, they attacked Singapore, and they attacked the Aleutian Islands. On the same day, they also invaded Thailand, right?
The Japanese all at once.
Yeah, they did on whatever the date, the 21st of December, I think, 1941. The same date as, in fact, the first deaths in the Japanese war took place over Malaysia. There was a huge fleet came down and moored in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. And they knew it was an invasion fleet, but they didn't know, the Allies didn't know if they were going to go to the Philippines or if they were going to go to Malaysia or they were going to go to Thailand, right? And meanwhile, at the same time, Songkran is telling the Allies, we will fight to the death, to the Thais. We'll fight to the death and we'll support the Allies. At the same time, he's writing documents to the Japanese, we will join with you, right? So he was completely strung out. And then the Japanese came. So how did he deal with this? He was warned they were coming, so he went to review the troops on the Cambodia border with the war that was going on there. Or it was a stalemate by then, brokered stalemate by Japan. They said, we will come in on the Thai side to Vichy France from China if you don't agree to give them this much. Mm-hmm. So he got his glory. I got all this new land for Thailand. So he disappeared for 3 days. Meanwhile, the Japanese arrived, and the Thais fought them. They made 9 landings. They didn't land in Phuket, but they landed on the other side, and about 9 hours later, they came here. But the Thais put up a really good fight, right? So they fought them in Prachapkirikan, where a big battles there, where they killed 200-300 Japanese the first night. All down the peninsula, they fought, and they fought very bravely. And even the Boy Scouts, because the Boy Scouts were being formed into, he'd already got the young tigers. He was training young kids to be like in the military, the same as Hitler was, same as Mussolini. Even the Boy Scouts went and fought with the Japanese, and they held off the Japanese, but a lot of people were getting killed. It was quite brutal fighting on the first Japanese landings here. They came across the border from Cambodia. They started bombing in Bangkok. And no one could reach Pewin Songkran. And no one could make a decision without him. And no one knew which way he was going to go, right? Mm. He eventually came back to Bangkok after a day and a half. And he said, okay, we've decided the Japanese are our friends. And we're going to let them have safe passage through Thailand to Malaysia, right? That's all they wanted. The Japanese gave them an ultimatum. You can fight us, you can give us free passage through, or you can join us. Mm-hmm. And he said, the middle way, we'll give them free passage. So
why did they want the passage to Malaysia to control that
Well,
strait?
so they could go down and attack Malaysia and get all the rubber and then take Singapore from the.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the main British force here with the Prince of Wales, these 2 big battleships, they were sunk that night. The night 4 days later, they were sunk because people hadn't realized it became an air war at sea, and the battleships were useless against dive bombers. Mm-hmm. So they were sunk. So the British had no real power anymore.
Where were those ships sunk exactly?
Off Kota Terengganu, off Malaysia.
Okay.
On the east coast of Malaysia, and sunk with thousands of people on them. They destroyed the Americans in the Philippines. They destroyed Pearl Harbor. So suddenly the Japanese were in control here. Now, in many ways, it was a good thing what he did by joining the Japanese, because a bit later, when he saw the Japanese pushing into Burma and took Singapore and then took Indonesia and Sumatra and got all the oil, he goes, well, hold on. The whites are gone. I'm going to join with the Japanese. So he allied with Japan and Germany, and he figured he could get more out of this. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the people here didn't want him to do that. They wanted him to stay neutral. But the Chinese here, remember, they hated the Japanese. They were killing all their relatives.
Of course.
But at the same time, have you heard of the Sukching massacres, or when the Japanese got and killed in Singapore, killed in Penang, killed in Malaysia?
Yeah.
They never killed all the Chinese here. So the Japanese did come here. They took over the airfield because it's one of the most westerly airfields covering the Indian Ocean. They built another airfield down near, and there was quite a big. They used
which airfield here?
Well, they took the main airport. Well, there was no airfield. There was an
airfield.
Buket airfield, and they also built another airfield here in Manik somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but some older people tell me roughly where it was. And then they started bringing their ships and using it as the port. Again, they wanted tin, right? You need tin in an army as well, right? You need to build ships. And overall, and then the Thais joined them and then attacked the British with the Japanese in Burma, so that he could then try and win back the land that the British had been stealing from Siam, right, in Burma. And the British said, well, sorry, and that was when they came in and bombed the King's Palace in Bangkok. So there was quite a lot of fighting went on here. The Thais try and keep quiet. It wasn't honorable what they did, right? So they allowed the Japanese to build the death railway through so they could get through to Burma. But prior to that, just north of here, they made their first railway across the peninsula so the Japanese could come across.
Do you think they'll eventually dig out a strait through, let's say, I guess it would have to start up by like Ranong right over to the west.
There's been a lot
coast.
of talk about it. It started with de Lesseps, the guy who, after he built the Panama Canal.
Because wouldn't that give Thailand so much more control over shipping?
Yes.
So what do you think would be stopping that? Is that even a topic that could be? Is it Singapore's influence that would just not allow
that? Initially, de Lesseps came and said he would cut through it's called the Kra Canal.
Yeah, because you can see it come in, and I mean,
it goes from it's called Kantan, the port. It's just down below Koh Lanta. You cut diagonally through there. It's the old trade route, right?
Yeah.
And it comes out. You just cut through the mountains for a little bit, and you come out near the lakes on the other side.
Okay, I was thinking you wouldn't cut up near like Ranong and across that way.
No, that's the shortest land bit, but it's high mountains. The easiest way is that way. That's called the Kra Canal. It was talked about 10 years ago even. There was full of the papers here. Someone they could finance it. Look, de Lesseps came to do it, first of all, and the British stopped the Thais allowing him to do it. He had the funding to do it because the British wanted to control Singapore. They wanted to control the trade. That would just cut the legs off Singapore.
Right.
The Japanese proposed to do it in the 1930s. They said they would pay for the Kra Canal. And the British again said, no, you do that, we're invading. That ain't happening. After the war, there was talk about doing it as well because it makes sense.
Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense.
I mean, it's in terms of logistics. I mean, you got to go around. This
again,
entire
the British have stopped it because they
Yeah.
wanted to protect Singapore and Malaysia. They wanted their influence. But now that they're not so strong, it came up again about 10 years ago. There was a consortium of Japanese who were going to build the Kra Canal because for Japan to cut through there, it saves them going all the way around through the Straits of Malacca. They cut through there, cut through the Suez. They need all their oil from. It makes a lot of sense for the Japanese, but Singapore, Malaysia, I think they don't want it. Or can you ever get that arranged here? I mean, think of the corruption who knows?
Yeah.
But it's on the cards. The drawings are all in place. The engineering's done.
Absolutely.
And it could be done.
Probably not in our lifetime.
No, was that not mine? Maybe yours. I'm a bit old, but no, it probably won't be done. Anyway, so there we go. So then, of course, the tide turns. The Americans beat up the Japanese. The British start winning. They take them out of Burma. And then Pibun Songkran realizes he's backed the wrong pony. And there was a lot of resistance here. Really good stories in the book because a lot of records were kept of the British submarines were coming up here, sinking all the shipping. when the Japanese did come here, there was something like 65 or 70 expats living here. They had the tennis club in Phuket town. They had the golf. There wasn't a golf course here, but there was quite a few expats working in mines and the banks and stuff here. And they all actually, there's a great getaway story. And I got the diary from the Australian officer who led them. And what they eventually did was they actually took their boat. They got on one of the Chinese mining guys, let them use an old tin boat. Because at that point, the Japanese had already reached Ranong and they were flying.
And they were just trying to get out of here.
They were trying to get to Singapore to safety, or to Penang, but Penang had fallen by then. So they had to gather and also up in Phang Nga, they had to gather all the expats together. They got them on a boat, and a Chinese, local Thai Chinese who supported the British, he gave them their boat. Actually, he rented it at an extortionate price, right? But he let them have it, which was a risk for him. And they actually sailed north to pick up some people near Ranong, and then they sailed and they got down to Singapore, and some of them, like the guy, whatever his name is, it's all well covered in the book. He ended up working behind the Japanese lines in Burma and with the Chindits, and did some big damage. So there's some pretty interesting war stories amongst the expats. Okay, what happens after the war? The people rebel against. They rebel against Wichit Songkran. Yeah. Pretty, who's the leftist guy who was fighting him, comes in. And the Brits say, okay, screw this. We need reparations, right? You fought with them. You attacked us in Burma. We're going to take Phuket, finally. You know, fuck you. You attacked us. You let him through. We were supporting you. You turned tail on us. You let him come through to Malaysia. You confiscated all our mining equipment, right? We want reparations. You confiscated 2 or 3 ships that were here. They're all British goods. So we want Phuket Island as reparation, and we'll do our tin mining again. Because 1940 was a huge year for tin mining. They had the big dredgers here. They were smashing through the mining. The biggest year of tin production was 1940 here, just before the war, because there was huge demand for tin, and they were making huge money. The Thais tried to take over all these tin mines and everything when they kicked the British out. The British came back and demanded reparations. They wanted the whole of the island. But the British were exhausted in the war. They were in debt to America, part of the Marshall Plan. They had no weapons. They were borrowing all the American gear. And the Americans said, no. We're not going to let them. You can't take Phuket. We don't like colonialism, right? That was, remember the principle of the Americans was because all their colonies were land-based, apart from Hawaii, and then suddenly Puerto Rico and Philippines, they always made things, you can't have overseas colonies. And as America got stronger, Britain and Europe had to pull back their colonies. Ultimately, the Suez Crisis was the end of it. Mm-hmm. So the Americans said, look, you've got no power here. We're going to take care of Thailand because we need it as a base to fight against communism, which was now spreading in China. It was in Russia. It was in China. They were looking at Vietnam. It was already in Laos, right? And so they said, and the British said, well, like in Japan, destroy the military. The Americans agreed. They destroyed the military-industrial complex, get rid of all the people, put them all in jail, the Americans. But they would not do it in Thailand because they needed the Thai military to help them fight. Remember, there were communists in Thailand, a lot of communists. There were communists in the in Malay states, right? The communist problem that the British had. And the Americans said, no, we can work with the military. We know they're a bunch of cunts. We know they're corrupt. We know everything, but we can work with them. And the military then got their power. They invited the king back, who'd been banished to Europe. The new king who just died, who was a great king, I must say. Laterally, right? Laterally, he was a great king. He came back. Well, his brother came back first. His brother was shot. You know about that story. It's a mystery who did it. They reckon it was 2 palace guards who were affiliated with the communists. Was the king a puppet of the military at first, or was he independent? I don't even want to go into all that.
No.
Don't go there.
No.
but ultimately he turned out to be a great king for the country. So the military were in control. The military were then funded to hell by the only budget that is never disclosed here is the military budget. So whatever the government gets, they can give as much money to the military can take, and it's not disclosed. So who knows? The king's income is not always fully disclosed, and nor is the military budget. Everything else, it works normally. But when you have massive outgoings like that, so the Americans, as the Vietnam War got worse and worse, now we're talking into the 50s and particularly the 60s, they supported the hell out of Thailand, right? And they supported the military.
As being a strategic, at least, base or jump off to get into...
remember the domino theory.
Yes.
If Vietnam fall, Laos fallen, Cambodia will fall, Thailand will fall next, the commies in Malaysia, the British were fighting they'll fall, the Burmese had there are a lot of communists in the and China will just take over Southeast Asia. So the bastion against it was Thailand, and the bastion was the Thai military. So the Americans allowed them to remain strong, and they funded them and they did everything. So it became then a de facto American colony, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating there, but America controlled.
And this is when the army is showing up in Pattaya.
Yeah, and then there was democracy. No, the army controlled. And still today, you don't get a fair vote here, right? The king and the party and military get most of the votes, right? Allocated seats. You can vote for the rest. Go ahead. And that's why they so much didn't like Thaksin. Well, I didn't like Thaksin because he was a corrupt crook, but he was fighting on behalf of the majority of the people. And they were getting power. And look, anyone in power here puts their nose in the trough and sucks it dry for a few years. But Thaksin overdid it, right? And so the military had to kick him out. Then his sister came, and then they kick him out. And the military still run the place. There's whatever you say, they still run it. And whether the king is in cahoots with the military or not is another question we won't go to.
Yeah, you probably don't want
but
that.
The military
will ban us.
And the police, they've still got the power. So, yeah, there was a lot of revolutions. There was a lot of student demonstrations. And then they were saying it's communist, and they put it down harshly. Generally, it's all...
But generally, they're just trying to keep communism out of Thailand so that this domino effect doesn't trickle down to Singapore.
Well, that was, previously, but that's not the question now. I mean, it's not...
No, it's not. It's not.
It's not... Thailand's not going to be communist.
At which point did, Thailand become Thailand in terms of, the name Thailand as its country?
I think it was 1941.
The defining borders between let's just say Laos and Thailand, because these borders are obviously they're all carved by the Mekong or mountains. Like, for example,
what happened was that the borders on the east side with Cambodia and have been set by treaties between Indochina and they used to go all to the Annamite Mountains. It was all Thailand, Laos, and eastern Cambodia. The French, very cheekily, bullyingly, just took that off them. And they fought. There were fights where the Siamese were fighting in the 1870s against the French. They lost, right, because they didn't have the technology. As Chulalongkorn said, he said, even if we found the biggest gold mine in this country, and I had all the money in the world, I couldn't buy weapons because the Western countries won't sell them to me, right? So I'm left with this. I either swim up the river with the alligator, meaning the French, or swim out to sea and cling on to the whale, meaning go with the Brits. And he said, look, the British, to my mind, have got more land than they know what to do with. And they've always been reasonably fair in their dealings with people compared to the French. So that's why he generally aligned Siam with the British. And the British, at the same time, said to him, if you align with us, we will stop the Germans and the French from stealing more, or the Russians, or the Chinese. We will protect you, but you do what we said. That was the original thing. By the end of the Second World War, the Britons weren't strong enough. And the Americans were. And the Americans then protected them. So they've been protected, but they've also been good diplomats. Anyway, look, we're coming near to the
Yeah,
end.
we must hour and a half. Oh, perfect.
Okay, well, I'll just finish quickly. But in its Americanization, more and more troops came here for R&R, right, in Bangkok. And as I say, then you got the backpackering thing starting. And that's
like the 70s, 60s,
70s. People started coming. They learned of this little island. You could get magic mushroom pancakes. You could get that. Go. And it slowly became more and more a tourist area. And Thai Airways eventually joined the Thai International with Thai Domestic, so you could fly straight down here. And it's been a slow evolution ever since of it turning into a tourist island and away from mining. Now, why did they stop the mining? They stopped the mining because they mined out most of the good areas, right?
And the tourists are arriving. You don't want these massive...
Yeah, so the first big Chinese family was the hotel, the one in Phuket town with the bowling ring in it. They own the Phuket City Hotel. That was a big Thai family, and they were the first to go, we're building a hotel. And apparently all the other mining bosses go, are you crazy? You just dig the ground and sell it for more. He goes, no, I can see this is coming to an end. Tourism's where to go. And so they made a move and turned it more and more into a tourist place. We covered some of this last week. Yeah. And that's how we end up today. And it's just going from strength to strength to strength, and the whole internet world and the internet economy. And as a quality place to live, it's bar none, I think.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you're not, well, it just got everything here. It's got everything.
Yeah, there's no better place in Southeast Asia.
And as you get more and more accessibility through, I mean, this could be beaming to, Alaska. It can be booming to Antarctica in 2 minutes. And you can be flying out of here direct to, 50 places.
Yeah, there's nothing. I've lived in Southeast Asia long enough. There's no, for living, this is the best hub. I mean,
I think so, yeah.
Where else?
And it's still pretty free here.
It's quite free.
No one bothers you. Leave me alone.
Bali's a nightmare. I mean, these places. I mean, you can't. You leave the airport and you're in bumper to bumper motorcycle traffic. Here, it's you get off. It's free. It's easy to get around. Okay, we're just about to wrap it up. I had one question in the back of my head. Those giant houses you see on the highway. So, like, if you were to go up to the Heron's Monument and turn right, like going into Phuket town, and then on the left, there's a massive house with a gate. Who owns these houses, or that one?
Well, I know that owner, but they're Thai Chinese families.
Oh, is it all like? I was wondering if they're related. Like, are they involved in the political side? Is this come from old money back in the day?
Yeah.
Are you allowed to talk about that, or?
Yeah, no, it's not.
Because everyone knows that these houses. There's another one also on the bypass road to Central.
There's many in Phuket town. These are mansions, Chinese mansions that were built by the rich tin miners. There's loads of them. If you look up the back streets, they're beautiful buildings. They're beautiful. They're all coming from Penang style, Penang architects, and they all really started forming in 1915, up until about 1940 when this was the biggest tin mining center of the world, and there was huge money being made here, and there was banking, and they had that sort of money. What they did with their extra money was they went and bought land and put rubber trees on it, right? Now, what the hell has happened to land here since? There are families here who own 10,000 rai, right? Can you imagine that it's gone from 50 baht a rai to 10 million baht a rai, or 100 million if you own. They are so rich here, these people. So they're kind of keeping to their heritage. It's the same as old Phuket town. When I first came here, it was a shithole, right? It was dirty. There was phone wires everywhere. They've taken the phone wires down. They're proud of their heritage. They're making them into nice coffee shops. They're doing them up. It's like Penang. It's like anywhere getting rich and proud of their heritage. And this is one reason why I get so frustrated, that they just ignore their history. We should have a proper museum here. I mean, I'm looking at it as a commercial business. I was. I'm not now, but I was. As a commercial business, a museum is a real good event. You take the family, you do tour trips, you can do many things, show movies, they can smelt tin or whatever, make an interactive event and find the old fort. But they're not taught about their history properly. They don't know it properly. The Chinese know their Chinese history well, and they show that, right? They show that a lot now in Phuket town, and it's good to see. Mm-hmm. But the Thais tend, I don't know why they don't. They're not. They only talk about certain aspects of their history. I think a lot of it is not. They're not proud of.
Well, maybe there's better ways to spend your energy to make money in Phuket than on a museum where.
No, I'm not talking about me. I'm just talking about their general pride. I mean, if you come to any Thai, you say, "Do you know about the?" You know, they'll say, "Well, Phuket's always been Thai." You know, well, it hasn't. It actually became a majority Thai island in about 1950s because people in Songkran didn't allow the Chinese to come anymore. So suddenly the workers were people from Isan. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's the other big population center where they need jobs. And they're the ones still coming today and populating this island. So, you know, 2 out of every 3 Thais you meet here is from Isan. And 1 out of every 5 is from Phuket. But no, the Phuket people are great. I mean, the Thai people are great. You know they're great. Some of the government officers are a bit off, but as a people, they're great people. Friendly, nice, easygoing. And it's really good to see them getting rich and enjoying their heritage in Phuket town.
Well, I think that's a positive note to end this on. What we'll finally do is we'll kick it back to you and let people know again where they can find the book. Well, we've talked about it, and we'll probably chat about it again if we can do an audio version as well,
sure,
maybe on Amazon. And also, if you want to tell anyone if they want to contact you to find your 10-bagger club, and you can explain all that on that camera there. And you can grab your book too if you want to give it a.
Yeah, I'm not going to bring 10-bagger club. It's an investment. Okay. You can look up 10-bagger club if you want. That's an investment thing I do now.
That's something. I guess that's on. If people want to show up to the crypto meetup, do we want to talk?
No, that's another thing.
Okay, we'll keep that. We'll keep that separate for another time. Okay.
This is. It's kind of. Can you see it on the?
Well, a lot of people are listening on Spotify as well, or Apple.
You can see.
Okay, this is the book. It's actually weighs over 1 kilo. 1,000 baht. Look, the best place to buy it, and I'm going to help my friend out here, is...
And bring your mic down a bit.
The best place to buy it is in Drinks & Co. in Boat Avenue.
Yep.
Easy to find. Justin, and they're there. Lady Pie sells it as well. They used to be in the Thai bookshops, Asia Books, all that, but it just got so complicated dealing with them. I would say there's nowhere in the south at the moment I'm selling it, but it used to be at one. You take either contact me through the thing, or it's cmackay100@gmail.com, Mackay, or go to Drinks & Co. in.
Yeah, we'll make it easy. Just go to Drinks & Co. at Boat Avenue, and grab a few bottles of wine and a book.
Yeah,
there you go.
Go to sleep.
Okay. That wraps it all. Thanks a lot, Colin. I think this time we have the full story of the history of Phuket. Last time I had to fly to Bangkok, so we rushed the end. But I think we've really dove into the details. If there's any questions in the comments, just let us know. If you're a dickhead in the comments, fuck off. Okay, that's it. We're out.